Hey everybody, this is a piece from the book Marxism, the Millennium and Beyond. Um, who's this? Is this thing edited by? Edited by Mark Cowling and Paul Reynolds. Um, the piece is titled "Democratic Marxism: The Legacy of Hal Draper." Um, why am I reading this? I suppose the main reason I'm reading this, for one, um, as opposed to just something straight from Hal Draper himself, is because I'm kind of trying to get a better feel for the macro level history of ideas. So Hal Draper was obviously a very important political thinker, um, coming from the third camp Trotskyist tradition in the United States. But he wrote, obviously he wrote the five or so really fat volumes titled Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, which I have certain excerpts from on here. And so I'm interested in Marx reception. A lot of some of the stuff I've put up, say for instance, like the Jan Hoff, Marx Worldwide, and books like that is more about the how the critique of political economy has been received. But I'm kind of also interested in the way that Marx's political thought has been received. So it's just before I started reading this, I was reading an article um, by Bruno Bongiovanni on Maximilien Rubel, and his work and positions on Marx. Um, so that's why I'm reading it. Also, Alan Johnson wrote a really good piece called "Third Camp is Living Legacy," and uh, he's also written a lot of other things. He's written obviously on left anti-Semitism. I think he also comes from the third campus Trotskyist tradition in Great Britain around the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. Although I think he's moved more towards a social democrat, and or something like that, or some kind of democratic socialist, but one that is not. Whereas some democratic socialists are somewhat still have a campist mind, right? So maybe someone like Corbyn or something like that. Whereas Alan Johnson, I would say, if you're talking about the three camps, say the first camp is the United States, second would be the Soviet Union, and third, and the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, and the third being the independent struggle of the working class. I think Alan Johnson tends to, or I don't know, tends to. I think he just does. Um, uh, uh, Endorse the first camp, so the Western camp. Now, um, to my understanding, at least. Even though who's the other camp opposed to the West, Um, but yeah, so he's had some political changes, to my understanding, at least, and also but he was supposed to write, I think, in this period. I think this piece is from 2000. He was supposed to write in this period. I know his big thing was to write a biography of Hal Draper, but I don't think that ever came to fruition. I think around this time, I'm guessing, this is just guess. I think around this time was kind of a big moment for the changes of Johnson's approach. To my understanding, I'm riffing here, but with the 9/11 and World War One, and not World War One, Jesus Christ, 9/11 and the war in Iraq and so forth, and Afghanistan, and some of the really bad left wing understandings of something like 9/11, and I think kind of pushed him into more putting himself a little bit more of a critical distance um, from radical left politics in general. Even though he does still speak very highly of Alliance for Workers' Liberty and has featured them on his channels, on some of the websites he's controlled still. Um, but anyway, I'm interested in Alan Johnson and Hal Draper, is both of them, so I'm reading this piece. So it starts with a number of quotes here. So, quote, However well-intentioned Marxists are nowadays about the need to value democracy, the latter simply cannot play a significant theoretical role in the class analysis of politics. Unquote. Gregor McLennan. Quote, the iron dictatorship exercised by the Stalinist police administrative apparatus over the Soviet proletariat was not incompatible with the preservation of the proletarian nature of the state itself, any more than the fascist dictatorships exercised over the bourgeois class were with the preservation of the nature of the capitalist state. Unquote. Perry Anderson. And if you know anything about Perry Anderson, this is in perfect keeping with his political sympathies being for not even orthodox Trotskyism, I would say, but more Deutscher influenced Trotskyism, which was way more openly like pro-Soviet bloc, I would say, than even orthodox Trotskyism. So that statement right there, which is a dogmatic reiteration of Trotsky's degenerated workers' state thesis, is on brand. Quote, political power is not a precondition for bourgeois rule. Why should it be a precondition for working class rule? End quote. Oliver MacDonald. I don't know who Oliver MacDonald is, nor did I know who Gregor McLennan is. Quote, Stalinism is a social system based on the state ownership of the decisive means of production and the uncontrolled domination of the state machine by the bureaucracy, not by the working people. The state owns industry and an uncontrolled bureaucracy, quote, owns the state. Socialism, on the other hand, is the collective ownership of the decisive means of production under the democratic control of the working people themselves. The vast difference is the existence of democracy for the mass of people. This is so because of the very nature of the working class as a class. Unlike the bourgeoisie, which is by nature a property-owning class, it does not develop its economic and social power within the womb of the old society. The bourgeoisie could do this under feudalism because its social power is expressed in the first place through its ownership of the private property on which the wealth of society rests. The working class, which owns no property, can, quote, own and control the means of production only through a political intermediary, the state. And it can, quote, own and control the state only through democratic participation. Without democracy, statification points not to socialism, but to what we know as Stalinism. Democracy, therefore, is not merely a sentimental or moral value for the Marxist, nor is it merely a preference. It designates the only way in which the rule of the working class can exist in political actuality, end quote. Hal Draper. One of the things, this is a very excellent statement of the bureaucratic collectivist position, meaning that it's arguing that the USSR is a class society, but he's not saying that it's a capitalist class society. And he's it seems like to me, to my knowledge of bureaucratic collectivist thought. So, for instance, the work of Shachtman and Carter, the tradition that Draper comes out of, he knew both these people well. To my understanding, not to my understanding, but both of those thinkers, the bureaucratic collectivist thinkers, thought that it was sufficient for the means of production to be nationalized in the massive way that they were in the Soviet Union, for capitalism to be abolished, right? So for them, if private property is abolished, capitalism is abolished. So they're not state capitalists. I think that's that assertion, not that the assertion that state capitalism, I'm spacing out here. The assertion that the state can if property's nationalized, it's automatically not capitalist seems like dubious to me. But that doesn't mean that you know, to define that it is capitalist would require a lot more theoretical work, right? You'd have to talk about the roles of commodities and value, buying and selling, those kinds of things, which are necessary features of capitalism, in order to determine that a state with a fully nationalized economy is still capitalist. You'd have to do more theoretical work, and that any meaningful conception of the USSR as capitalist would have to offer in a sophisticated way that does not that puts the commodity character of the labor product front and center. It's also important. This is my favorite thing about bureaucratic collectivists, is that it just makes it makes a very, very important distinction, I think, between socialism or communism. They use the word socialism kind of following the Leninist idea of that's what's immediately on the horizon, and then communism, some other different type of society that's kicked down the road by generations or whatever. But for them, they emphasize that socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat. So I mean, that socialism, I think, sorry, I'm spacing out. The thing that I think is most interesting about the bureaucratic collectivist thesis is that it offers a way of critiquing anti-capitalism from an anti-capitalist perspective, from a socialist perspective, making a distinction between socialism and anti-capitalism, because they're very much committed to the view that Stalinism was anti-capitalist. And regardless of whether or not the USSR was capitalist in the Stalin period before or after, assuming that it's not, it demonstrates that you can have an exploitative, oppressive, dominant society that isn't a capitalist society, and I think that's extremely important extremely important political idea. Anyway, end quote, Hal Draper. So now I can actually read the piece. How many today would disagree with Vasily Grossman's suggestion in his book Forever Flowing, part novel, part meditation on the Soviet Gulag, that behind all those crazed eyes, smashed kidneys, the skulls pierced by a bullet, rotting infected, gangrenous toes, and scurvy rat corpses in log cabin dugout morgues, and stands for the figure of Karl Marx? I'm trying to think of who Vasily Grossman is, but I think Vasily Grossman might have been one of the people who wrote like a book documenting the Holocaust that was written in the Soviet Union, that was kind of buried by the Soviet Union or not allowed to see publication in the Soviet Union. But maybe I'm making that up. The idea of a genetic link between Marx and Stalin has established itself as a, quote, normal science, and to paraphrase the poet Yevtushenko, the guard has been trebled over Marx's tomb. Marxism must confront the horrors of its 20th century past if it is to have a 21st century future. Each and every foothold offered the Gulag must be rooted out. This chapter examines one contribution to the task: Hal Draper's excavation of an alternative, radically democratic Marx, and the development of a democratic Marxism by the group he helped to lead, the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League. The Workers' Party being started, obviously, by people around Max Shachtman, but not just Max Shachtman, of course. And the Independent Socialist League is what it became in, I believe, 1949. The same organization, but they I think a number of things. I think they were trying to get off of some kind of prescription list, being a prescribed organization. I think that might have been part of it, but they felt that it was kind of dogmatic and ridiculous to call themselves a party when they were so small in that period. At least that's my memory of it. Maybe I'm mistelling it. Anyway, this chapter examines one contribution to the task: Hal Draper's excavation of an alternative, radically democratic Marx, and the development of a democratic Marxism by the group he helped to lead, the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League, WPISL, from 1940 to 1958. Draper's achievement was threefold. First, a unique reinterpretation of the history of socialism as a war between, quote, two souls. Quote, socialism from above, the authoritarian imposition of a collectivist social order, and, quote, socialism from below, the self-emancipatory struggle of the exploited and oppressed. Second, in his 4-volume book, Karl Marx, so it's only 4 volumes? I thought there was a 5th volume, but I think the 5th volume, maybe the 5th volume is edited by one of Hal Draper's followers, Ernest Haberkern, wrote the book, either Capitalism or Socialism, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, which is kind of like a collection of primary sources putting forward the bureaucratic collectivism thesis but he was a follower of Draper. I think edited a number of his works. I think he edited the book that's titled Socialism from Below, that's available at Haymarket. So he, what was I going to say? Draper, so Haberkern might have edited a 5th volume that is not his. And maybe this also could have happened after this essay was published. I don't know when that 5th volume came out. But anyway, in his 4-volume Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, one of the great pieces of Marxist scholarship of the 20th century, Draper cast Marx as the founder of socialism from below, a man who, by defining, quote, socialism as an open-ended process of self-emancipation, established socialism, democracy, and liberty as a chain of necessary relations. A chain of necessary relations. Draper helps us to separate this democratic Marxism from its totalitarian, quote, doppelganger. Third is the collective achievement of the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League, described recently by Stanley Aronowitz as, quote, the most intellectually vital of all the radical formations in the 1940s and 1950s, and, quote, in the United States. I'm not sure what Stanley Aronowitz's background is. I think he wrote a book on historical materialism, but for some reason I have it in my gut that he might have written for Root and Branch in the 1970s and 1960s. Root and Branch being kind of the a council communist journal in the United States, or I think it called itself Libertarian Socialist, just for whatever reason. But it was around Paul Maddock Jr. wrote in it a lot. I think Paul Maddock Sr. wrote in it a lot. I think it might have been Paul Maddock Jr.'s project. But it had people like Fred Mosley, for instance, who's written a lot on the transformation problem in Marx's Critique of Political Economy. But I think Stanley Aronowitz might have been somewhat involved in that. And also the guy, I can't remember his name, it's not coming to me off the top of my head, but the guy who wrote the book Strike. That was a history of class struggle in the United States. I think he was also part of it at that time. I don't know where all these people are now, but I think Stanley Aronowitz, I think that he worked in that circle. I'm not sure though. So it would make sense that he calls it the most intellectually vital of all the radical formations in the 1940s and 1950s. I think there's some overlap between libertarian socialism and the radical democratic socialism of Draper. Theorizing socialism, liberty, and democracy is indivisible, each the necessary foundation of any open process of self-emancipation. The Workers' Party Independent Socialist League was able to subject both Stalinism and post-war capitalism to a comprehensive democratic Marxist critique. This body of writing from the 1940s and 1950s and Draper's later Marx scholarship is attracting an ever wider readership among a younger generation of rebels who find themselves amid the dust and rubble of the so-called, quote, worker states, and know that restoring hope to socialism and purpose to Marxism will involve tending the democratic soul of both. New section. The, quote, two souls of socialism, end quote. Draper's first contribution was quite startling. He traced the disaster of 20th century Marxism to the, quote, ambiguous history of the socialist idea, end quote, itself. In a seminal essay first published in 1960, Draper retold that history is nothing less than a war between, quote, two souls, socialism from above and socialism from below. At stake, the meaning of socialism. Quote, socialism from above, Draper defined as, quote, the tendency to conceive of socialism, as a societal rearrangement to be handed down to the grateful masses, by a ruling elite which is not in fact subjected to the masses' control, or indeed to be imposed upon the people from above, whether they are grateful or not, end quote. Draper, quote, socialism from below, by contrast, quote, puts all emphasis on the subversive transformation of the source of controlling power in society, the displacement of the power from up to down, from up above to down below, and the extension of this control from below, not only to political but also to economic life. Its corollary is that socialism can be realized only through the self-emancipation of activized masses in motion, reaching out for their autonomy, quote, freedom from their own hands, mobilized from below in a struggle to take charge of their own destiny as actors, not merely subjects, on the stage of history, end quote. Draper. The subversive idea at the essay's heart was that socialism from above had enjoyed near uncontested dominance within the socialist tradition until Marx founded a democratic alternative by fusing political democracy and the social question on the ground of self-emancipation. Draper's account of the prehistory of his essay captures his own shock at this discovery. Quote, during most of the 1950s, I edited an independent socialist weekly titled Labor Action, which regularly attacked both capitalism and Stalinism. Someone drafted a statement titled, Stalinism is not socialism. I'm sure we all believed that assertion. In the middle of 1958, I settled down to a period of reading and research in the history of socialism that went on for almost a year and a half. Its focus was on tracing the anti-democratic, in modern slang, quote, authoritarian currents in the early and later formations of the socialist movement. I knew well enough that these currents existed. What I discovered, however, penetrated beneath the surface of popular socialistic historiography. The difficulty was not in finding the anti-democratic elements. It was in identifying any representatives, even a very few, of consistent advocacy of socialism from below, the only, quote, democratic socialism worth recognizing. Quote, Stalinism and its forerunners were in general authoritarian forms of socialist thinking and organization, had far more claim to the socialist tradition than I did. It was not a wild aberration, as the joint statement had seemed to say, end quote. In fact, whether Draper looked at the educational dictatorships proposed by Babeuf, Buonarroti, or Blanqui, the elitism and authoritarianism of Saint-Simon, Lassalle, Bellamy, or Proudhon, quote, all this democracy disgusts me, end quote. The philanthropy of Owen, Fourier, or Cabet, the bureaucratic planism of the Webbs, the statism of Bernstein, or the tyranny of Stalinism, it turned out that the dominant soul of socialism, close to the only soul in fact, was socialism from above. Socialism from above. Draper dedicated much of the rest of his life to excavating the other marginalized democratic soul of socialism, establishing Marx as its founding figure, delineating its specificity as a theory of self-emancipation, and its ramifications for the relation of socialism to democracy, and liberty, organization, and strategy, internationalism, and for the relation of working class and social movement. All right, 1 second. I want to copy that quote down because it's such a good quote. I think what I really like about that quote that I'm finding that this said from Hal Draper, is that this kind of this idea that this is a minority position, that in fact, actually democratic socialism was a minority movement within socialism. And of course, it depends by what you mean by, democratic and so forth. I know that, Draper, for instance, puts Lenin on the socialism from below his socialism from below Mount Rushmore, and I think that's extremely, extremely dubious. Anyway, where the hell am I? Draper dedicated much of the rest of his life to excavating the other marginalized democratic soul of socialism, establishing Marx as its founding figure, delineating its specificity as a theory of self-emancipation and its ramifications for the relation of socialism to democracy and liberty, organization and strategy, internationalism, and for the relation of working class and social movement. Draper argued the great divide in socialism was not peculiar to socialism. Quote, yearning for emancipation from above, and quote, had been the, quote, all-pervading principle through centuries of class society, end quote. Draper. The socialist idea had to arrive, quote, trailing after it all, these customary mental and spiritual habits and patterns, end quote. Draper. Only with the growth of the modern working class could the idea of self-emancipation and the discourse of socialism from below come blinking into the light. Draper identified the, quote, essential originality, end quote, of Marx in his theorization of self-emancipation, the, quote, first principle of his life work, end quote, as the basis for a new socialism. The 3 volumes of Marx's Capital are, quote, nothing but the demonstration of the economic basis, end quote, of self-emancipation. Defining socialism in this way positions socialism, democracy, and liberty as indivisible, or to borrow but also to extend a phrase of Norberto Bobbio, as a chain of necessary relations. Draper read the subsequent history of Marxism and socialism more generally as a, quote, continual but largely unsuccessful effort to free itself from the tradition of emancipation from above, end quote. Draper. Stalinism, the recrudescence of socialism from above in the form of bureaucratic absolutism in a backward country, was the legitimate heir to a long tradition of anti-democratic socialist thought. New section. Marx and the foundation of democratic Marxism. Quote, Marx was the first socialist thinker and leader who came to socialism through the struggle for liberal democracy, end quote. From 1970 to his death in 1990, Draper devoted himself almost exclusively to Marx scholarship. The main result was the 4-volume Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, 2,000 pages of meticulous textual exegesis and analysis of the political theory and practice of socialism from below. The central argument: Marx did not abandon liberty and democracy to become a communist, but became a communist in order to make real the promise of liberty and democracy. Draper mapped an essential continuity in this approach from his, quote, democratic views of 1842 to the revolutionary communism of his mature years, end quote. Draper traced Marx's lightning-quick journey in the early 1840s from a, quote, radical democratic liberal, end quote, to a, quote, revolutionary democratic communist, end quote. Draper begins as a, quote, Marx begins as a, quote, democratic extremist, end quote. Unambiguously for freedom of expression and organization, the rule of law and democratic institutions, viscerally opposed to the power of the state and its core, the bureaucracy. What forced the development of this, quote, democratic extremism, end quote, was his insistence on treating freedom and democracies not as abstractions, free-floating discourses, but in their external social relations here down on earth. The consequence, argues Draper, was not the dismissal of freedom as fraudulent, but the indictment of both the social relations of capitalism and unrestrained state power as inimical to freedom. Both would have to go. This unique journey to socialism ended with the foundation of a new concept of socialism. Draper summarized this development in Marx's political thought. Quote, Marx was the first socialist figure to come to an acceptance of the socialist idea through the battle for the consistent expression of democratic control from below. He was the first figure in the socialist movement who, in a personal sense, came through the bourgeois democratic movement, through it to its furthest bounds, and then out by its farthest end. In this sense, Marx was the first to fuse the struggle for consistent political democracy with the struggle for a socialist transformation. But it might be asked, wasn't it the case that, in his course from bourgeois democracy to communism, Marx relinquished his early naive notions about political democracy? Not in Marx's view. End quote. Draper. New section. Socialism is self-emancipation. Quote, Marx's theory moved in the direction of defining consistent democracy in socialist terms and consistent socialism in democratic terms. The task of theory, is not to adjudicate a clash between the two considerations, but but rather to grasp the social dynamics of the situation under which the apparent contradiction between the two is resolved, end quote. Draper. The, quote, social dynamics of the situation, end quote, were the rise of capitalism in the modern working class, which created the material ground on which the relationship of the social question to political freedom might be, quote, resolved through a political process of self-emancipation. Draper states, quote, this is the democratic heart of Marxism. For the first time in history, it has become possible for the, quote, lowest class to rule, that class on whose labor all the rest of society depends. For the first time, therefore, a new social order is possible in the interest of the most numerous class, whose rule by that token means the abolition of all class rule. It cannot substitute itself for the private rulers of property by itself gaining control of property. It can rule only through the collectivity, only democratically, end quote. Draper. The core or essential structure of democratic Marxism is this theoretical integration of socialism and democracy, not some economic necessitarianism. But the character of this new socialism from below, the way it overturns every variety dear to socialism from above, from the content of socialism to the strategy to achieve socialism, from the nature of a socialist polity to the role of socialist theory, has been little understood in Marx's time or subsequently. As self-emancipation, the content of socialism can no longer be the idea. There can be no blueprint. The socialist can no longer imagine the people to be, quote, a clean sheet of paper with no blotches, end quote, on which he or she writes, quote, beautiful words, end quote. These fascistic words are, as it happens, mouths. Understood in practice as self-emancipation, socialism is the pursuit of the interest, blotches and all, whereas Marx and Engels knew, quote, the, quote, idea always disgraced itself insofar as it was different from the, quote, interest, end quote, end quote. Draper noted that Marx rejected Bauer precisely because his, quote, conception of social reorganization was based on the antithesis between spirit and mass, end quote. Draper. Marx refused to think that, quote, the spirit, or the criticism, represents the organizing labor, the mass, the raw material, and history, the product, end quote. Draper. In other words, as self-emancipation, socialism cannot by definition be an organicism in which the individual's moral status or rights are abolished in the name of, quote, society or, quote, progress. Tocqueville's charge that socialism seeks a society of beavers, not individuals, is echoed in Marx's own critique of socialism from above. Draper defined socialism from below as not only revolutionary and democratic, but also humanistic, the moral status of the individual at its heart. Quote, the rights and privileges of the individual must not be subordinated to the glorification of state or communal collectivity, or to the maximization of its power, but exactly to the contrary, the authority and rights of the organized collectivity or state are justified only insofar as they contribute to the full development of every individual's potentialities as a human being. The beehive or anthill conception of collectivism is not socialism, but the image of a new tyranny, end quote. Draper. No less than the content, the strategy for achieving socialism is turned upside down once understood as self-emancipation. The enlightened dictatorship, beloved of socialists from Blanqui to Deng, is incompatible with the learning through doing, what Norman Garris has called, quote, interiority, which lies at the heart of self-emancipation as a social process. Strategy, therefore, is an open-ended process of practical critique. I think Norman Garris kind of had a similar trajectory to Hal Draper. I think they come from different backgrounds. Norman Garris is more of like a new left review kind of guy, and Alan Johnson was obviously Alliance for Workers' Liberty. I think Norman Garris is also older than Alan Johnson, but both kind of moved in a similar direction towards some kind of democratic socialist or like social democratic kind of politics, emphasizing like human rights, and so forth. Norman Garris also has written pieces about left-wing anti-Semitism, not merely historically, but as it directly pertains to Israel-Palestine. So, or Israel-centered anti-Semitism, taking that seriously as an actual thing that happens in the left. Anyway, strategy, therefore, is an open-ended process of practical critique. Quote, we do not dogmatically anticipate the world, but rather want to find the new world only through criticism of the old, end quote, said Marx. Draper shows how this led Marx and Engels directly to an engagement with bourgeois democracy, to refuse the anarchist rejection of politics, and to argue instead for a political struggle to realize the promise of bourgeois democracy through a fight for the extension of equality from the civil to the social and economic spheres. In 1848 to 49, Marx took a dynamic process of popular political struggle in which the demand for liberalization would stimulate a drive for constitutionalism. The demand for liberalization would constitute a drive for constitutionalism, a democratic political life and a government of laws, until this struggle in turn spilled over uninterruptedly to a revolutionary drive for democratization. A revolutionary drive for democratization of social and economic life as such, popular control from below. Marx saw the, quote, maturation of the agency of socialism as synonymous with the process of political struggle. Finally, the principle of self-emancipation transforms the nature and role of theory itself. Draper read Marx's third thesis on Feuerbach as the, quote, philosophic formulation of the principle of self-emancipation, end quote, Draper. And therefore, quote, the first time in socialist thought that theory turns around to take a hard look at the theoretician, end quote, Draper. Draper concluded that for Marx, quote, political theory develops as a guide to revolutionary practice, in the course of which the revolutionary changes society, and the struggle changes the revolutionary and his political theory, end quote. Draper. In other words, far from theory providing a blueprint to which the masses will be made to fit, self-emancipation suggests a reflexive and open Marxism, porous to experience. This reading of Marx as a democratic socialist from below often puzzles because it contradicts the common sense idea that Marx's concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat meant, quote, a developed political pluralism cannot be countenanced, end quote. It was one of Draper's major contributions to democratic Marxism to challenge this, quote, common sense about Marxism and the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat. New section, democratic Marxism and the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. In the third volume of Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, published in 1986, Draper traced the development of the term in the thought of Marx and Engels, and in the, quote, and in the book, the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, from Marx to Lenin, of 1987, carried the story through from the death of Engels in 1895 to the degeneration of the Russian Revolution in the 1920s. Draper concludes that there took place a, quote, fateful substitution, end quote, within the classical Marxist tradition of a dictatorial and non-democratic conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat for Marx's democratic original. Draper summed up the meaning of the term for Marx, quote, Marx inaugurated the phrase to emphasize that the political power gained in a socialist revolution must be exercised by the workers as a class, democratically organized as against the Blancist conception of a revolutionary dictatorship by a band of conspirators over the proletariat. It was only after Marx's time that the word dictatorship developed the almost invariably anti-democratic content which characterizes it today, unquote. I think they published in each other's journals. Like I think that Hal Draper published in journals that were controlled by Maximilien Rebel in France, and the same applies for Maximilien Rebel publishing. And then he has pieces in Labor Action, right? But I don't know what the development of Draper's thought, but I think one of the things they shared, actually, Rebel and Draper, to my understanding, share is the notion of like the anarchist tradition as represented. Well, not the anarchist tradition as such. They might say the anarchist tradition as such because they might use sloppy categories like that. But the idea that there was something extremely Leninist about Bakunin as like a conspiratorial elitist revolutionary. That would be something that at least Rebel would say, and also I think that's one of the grounds for Draper putting Bakunin in the socialism from above category. But Rubel would 100% coming from a council communist tradition, as opposed to coming from the third camp Trotskyist tradition, um, would definitely 100% put the Bolsheviks in this category of like conspiratorial Blancist Marxism, whereas I don't think Draper would. Anyway, widely accepted is the idea that the concept dictatorship of the proletariat establishes Marx as a Blancist is literally history turned upside down, reconstructing in detail the context of each and every use of the term in Marx's work. Draper establishes that the term was used by Marx to re-educated Blanquists away from Blanquism, to confront the Blanquist mind with his. Marx's own alternative conception of class rule, democratic control from below, the complete democratization of society. For Marx, the term did not refer to special dictatorial governmental forms at all, but referred only to the class content of the state, the quote, rule of the proletariat, end quote, which meant the working class leadership of an immense majority bloc. The governmental form of this rule was simply the democratic republic, popular control over the sovereign body of the state, universal suffrage, representative democracy, a democratic constitution, and truly mass involvement in political decision-making. Engels, in his 1895 critique of the Erfurt program, linked social form and political content thus, quote, the working class can come to power only under the form of the democratic republic. This is even the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the Great French Revolution has already shown, end quote. Engels. But Marx and Engels' democratic conception was substituted faithfully by the idea that, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, meant, quote, specific governmental forms and policies, quote, dictatorial ones, some special form of worker state, a specially, quote, dictatorial one, end quote. Draper. Draper traces the importance of the historic dominance of socialism from above in the fortunes of Marx's concept, quote, the people who, quote, misunderstood, wanted to misunderstand. They already had its conception about, quote, dictatorship, which they had absorbed before they ever knew Marx, and they merely used or ignored or attacked Marx's term in accordance with their own leanings, end quote. Draper. That seems very right. At least that's for people. I think that's at least apt for people today. I think what attracts people to the dictatorship of the proletariat concept today, as opposed to like feeling very rightfully weary of that concept. Whatever Marx might have meant by it, it's a very it's a very poor choice of words. I don't like that term at all. But I think what attracts people to that concept is like a kind of pre-existing populist will for revenge against the powerful. I think that's very much a part of it. Like to see like a trial, but have like some almost like yearning for some kind of trial by fire, as opposed to like creating emancipatory conditions, punishing people who were the beneficiaries of non-emancipatory conditions. Right. That kind of seems like why that this concept has been defended in such a way as it has. Check out the piece by Alan Johnson, which is a critique of Slavoj Žižek and his kind of idea of like this kind of the dictatorship of the proletariat is like a ruthless executive body that kind of does what it wants and is not subordinated to any kind of self-restraint, knowing no limitations of any kind. And that's an important part of any kind of, and people, I think it's a lot of people, different people talk about it. Castoriadis talks about it. I think Bookchin maybe talks about it. So does, what the fuck is his name? Cloud Lefort kind of talks about it, about like the necessity of like self-limitation of emancipatory of democratic political bodies, right? Not like some type of council system or something like that, requiring something akin to like the rule of law, right? Like something that says like, yeah, this is the boundaries, this is the limitations of power, of what violence can be done by the state to individuals. that remains an important aspect, right, of any kind of democratic conception of communism or socialism. Plekhanov was the originator of this fateful substitution, writing an anti-democratic Blancist conception of, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat into the program of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1903. I think Plekhanov was the first also to use the term dialectical materialism, which obviously became such an important feature of Soviet dogmatism and its very serious consequences for critically minded social scientists and natural scientists as well, i.e. Lysenko catastrophe. I think, what was I going to say? I had a thought here. I think Plekhanov is like one of those people that, at least for me, maybe he's not as much of a gray area for you, but it seems like he's one of those people who's like kind of like a very much a linchpin character in the history of the development of traditional Marxism, especially traditional Marxism in its Leninist Stalinist form, even though he wasn't a Leninist himself. He seems very important here in that tradition, and he kind of is like a gray area. He's like I don't really quite understand what he's about, or I don't really know his work that well, I guess is what I actually should say, or know much about him historically. Anyway, motivating his proposal, Plekhanov cast democracy as an expendable luxury, arguing, quote, salus revolutionis suprema lex, end quote. Draper points out this involves a crude, quote, means-end fallacy, end quote, which fails to grasp everything that is specific to socialism is self-emancipation, most notably the social nature of the working class and the political conditions of its maturation and rule. Lenin would argue that, quote, the scientific term, quote, dictatorship means nothing more nor less than authority untrammeled by any laws, absolutely unrestricted by any rules whatever, and based directly on force. The term, quote, dictatorship has no other meaning than this, end quote, Lenin. So this is, I want to say, intervene, and this seems very much, the fact that quote is a direct quote from Lenin thus far, and I don't think there's been too many direct quotes from people other than Draper thus far in this piece, even from Marx. The fact that this piece from Lenin signifies that Draper is, Johnson is very much departing, and perhaps this is the reason for his political departure towards like social democracy as away from this, but this kind of critique of Leninism took him out of what, because the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, for instance, is a Leninist organization, and has Leninist politics and self-conceives of itself as Leninism. Draper, especially, and this was an early essay, so he's writing, I think, when did he write Socialism from Below? I think in the early 1960s. But it seems like he always considered Lenin as part of the socialism from below tradition. This quote definitely would demonstrate that Alan Johnson, contra Hal Draper, does not think that, and in this sense is more akin to Rubel's understanding of Lenin and his position within the history of Marxism. Draper observes this definition was, quote, a theoretical disaster, first class, with nothing in common with any conception of the worker state held by Marx. The isolation of the Russian Revolution and the backwardness of the country itself determined that Plekhanov's substitute not only won out as necessity, but was theorized by Lenin and others as virtue. So maybe, and that's why to my opinion, it's such a misfortune that Johnson did not complete this biography of Draper, because it seems like Draper might be this is indicating to me that this book written later in the 1980s versus the other piece, his most famous piece from the 1960s, it seems like there's kind of like a development here. But yeah. Plekhanov, Lenin, Trotsky, and Bukharin, in the manner of their counterposition of, quote, bourgeois and, quote, proletarian democracy, reduced democracy per se to bourgeois, quote, bourgeois democracy, and flatly counterposed dictatorship to democracy. This, quote, theoretical disaster, end quote, had consequences of, quote, gutting socialism of its organic enrootment in the mass of the people, when Stalin took the lead in organizing the socioeconomic counter-revolution and class power, the, quote, juridical basis in theory, to use Trotsky's later expression, had already been laid. That fact is not gainsaid by another, namely that when Bukharin and Trotsky looked upon their handiwork, they started in horror and scrambled away in another direction. End quote. Draper. All this should surely challenge the glib and superficial idea, actually an intellectual police action, that any attempt to return to Marx is an eschatological quasi-religious enterprise. Given the tortuous intertwining of socialism from above and socialism from below in the Marxist movement in the 20th century, then what Draper called a materialist conception of socialist history might well be necessary, though obviously not a sufficient condition for a further advance of Marxist political theory. And nowhere is this more true than in relation to Stalinism. New section, the, quote, Russian question and democratic Marxism. Half a century ago, in a series of debates with Trotsky about Russia, which are virtually unknown within academic Marxism, some of the most talented Marxists of their generation readapted the democratic Marxist principle of self-emancipation for this era of Stalin, establishing, quote, in the most precise and scientific sense, end quote, as Herman Benson put it, that a active and plural democracy was the sine qua non of both a socialist politics of transformation and a socialist polity. I have a piece by Herman Benson that I think is if I'm remembering the correct, I think Herman Benson is comes from the third camp tradition. I don't know if he's actually would call himself a Trotskyist in any capacity or a Leninist in any capacity. I'm not sure. But I can't remember what his politics are, so don't quote me on that. But he wrote a review, and I have a number of reviews of this book on here of the two souls of, the two Trotskyisms confront Stalinism, or the fate of the revolution, the two Trotskyisms confront Stalinism, which is like volume 2 of the original Fate of the Russian Revolution, edited by Sean Matgomno with a very big and informative introduction. He wrote a review of that. So check out Herman Benson's review of that. I think he has other important articles, but I think he's mainly an activist as opposed to like a theoretician. But he comes from this tradition. The fundamental concepts at stake was democracy. Could a worker state exist without workers' political power? Was the nationalization of property a sufficient condition for the establishment of a worker state? The differing answers given would divide anti-Stalinist Marxism for the next half-century. Trotsky developed two positions on these questions, and gave birth to two Trotskyisms. It's funny. His initial position held that the meaning and significance of a, quote, nationalized economy was derived from the prior fact that the working class held political power, or at least that the, quote, locum of workers' power was for now a genuine workers' party. In short, quote, the character of the economy as a whole thus depends upon the character of the state power, end quote. While there was hope that the bureaucracy could be brought under control again, the reform perspective, it was still reasonable to call the USSR in its strictly limited sense a, quote, worker state. Trotsky saw the Stalinist bureaucracy as a temporary layer, a Bonapartist phenomena, balancing between the fundamental class forces which would settle the fate of the revolution. He admitted only two possibilities for Russia: backwards to the restoration of private property, or forwards to proletarian political power and socialism. But as Joseph Carter pointed out, I would say, being the person who kind of, his conception of bureaucratic collectivism, I think he was kind of the person who really, even though he dropped out of the movement, I think after World War II, just kind of, I think he might have been opened a bookstore in New York City somewhere, maybe a left bookstore, but I think for some reason I felt like I heard that somewhere. But he wrote a really good article called Bureaucratic Collectivism, and I think his positions on the Russian question came to be the dominant one within the independent part, the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League tradition. And it's definitely the Joseph Carter seems like one of the very fundamental influences on Hal Draper's entire political trajectory. He seems like a very important figure for Draper. Anyway, but as Joseph Carter pointed out, quote, Contrary to Trotsky's predictions, the destruction of the Bolshevik Party did not mean the end of state property and planning. Russia did not travel the road of Thermidorian capitalist restoration. On the contrary, the Stalinist counter-revolution took a new, hitherto unknown path, the road of bureaucratic absolutism, end quote. Draper. Joseph Carter. Faced with the strengthening of state property and the destruction of the political power of the working class, Trotsky faced a dilemma. I'm not sure this quote is, but I'm assuming it's Carter. Quote, either to maintain his old criteria and affirm that Russia is no longer a, quote, worker state, or to revise completely the Marxist conception of the worker state. Trotsky chose the latter course and thereby abandoned the Marxist view, ... He now affirmed that it was the state-owned character of property which determined the socialist character of property, which determined the socialist character of the economy, and the proletarian nature of the state, end quote. I'm assuming that's Carter. In other words, Trotsky reversed the relationship of politics and economics in his theory. Now, because property was nationalized, and because nationalized property was inherently proletarian, the state remained a worker state, progressive, and so to be unconditionally defended in war. The working class fantastically remained the ruling class, its rule now expressed through, congealed in, the nationalized property. The character of the economy now determined the class character of the state power. Matt Gomna has traced the consequences of this theoretical disaster of the first magnitude. What had begun as the idea that the Bolshevik old guard could protect temporarily the gains of the revolution developed into the view that the, quote, bureaucracy represented the working class in power as long as they still defended the nationalized property, nationalized economy, end quote. I'm not sure that quote is. It might be Matt Gomna. If there was ever a case of the idea disgracing itself insofar as it became separated from the interest, this was it. Matt Gomna suggests Trotsky gave birth to an idea which, quote, in its fully extended form, ... implied that the workers could rule as abstract historical subjects in, quote, high theory, even whereas living people, in practice, they were beasts of burden exploited by a privileged autocracy, end quote. Matt Gomna. It was Joseph Carter who first and most fully grasped that Trotsky's theory involved, quote, an important methodological error, a failure to give adequate recognition to the decisive, qualitative difference between proletarian and bourgeois rule, end quote. In 1940, Max Shachtman drew out the political importance of this. Quote, the rule of the proletariat cannot express itself in private ownership of capital, but only in its, quote, ownership of the state in whose hands is concentrated all the decisive economic power. Hence its social power lies in its political power. In bourgeois society, the two can be and are divorced. In the proletarian state, they are inseparable. From this, it follows in reality what does not follow in Trotsky's analysis. The proletariat's relations to property, to new collectivist property, are indivisibly bound up with its relations to the state, that is, to political power, end quote. Max Shachtman. Once this, quote, decisive qualitative difference between proletarian and bourgeois rule, end quote, is understood, then the concept of, quote, proletarian Bonapartism appears as an absurdity. First, the relation of the juridical and the socioeconomic in the determination of the class content of the state power is different in the proletarian as compared with the bourgeois revolution. Trotsky thought of, quote, property forms, end quote, and property relations, social relations, as one and the same thing. But property forms, that is, nationalized property, were a secondary factor. Primary was property relations, that is, the relations of the various groups in Russia to this property. The mere fact of nationalized property forms does not establish what the property relations are. What establishes that is the relationship of people to the state to which all property belongs. To define property relations in terms of property forms is to reverse the order of categorical purity. To define property relations in terms of property forms is to reverse the order of categorical priority, to replace social relations with a juridical illusion, and to substitute an economism for a rounded Marxist judgment. The consequences for one's ability as a Marxist to theoretically ground democracy are disastrous. Second, the consequence of the development of Bonapartism is different in the proletarian as compared to the bourgeois revolution. As Max Shachtman argued, quote, where a similar division of labor under capitalism does not transform the economic or political agents of the ruling class into a new class, it does tend to create a new class in a state reposing on collectivized property, that is, in a state which is itself the repository of all social property. End quote. Max Shachtman. Joseph Carter refuted the absurdity of, quote, proletarian Bonapartism, end quote, half a century ago. Trotsky defended his new position that the Stalinist state is a worker state, though the working class has no political power, by citing the bourgeois Bonapartist regime. The analogy would be valid only if the political expropriation of the working class had been accompanied by the strengthening of its economic and social power, its domination over society. Such was the case under all Bonapartist regimes. The political expropriation of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by the strengthening of its economic and social power. But what does the evidence show as regards Russia? Simply this, that the working class has been deprived of all economic and social as well as political power. This strengthening of state property and planning, which allegedly signifies the social rule of the proletariat, resulted in the increased economic, political oppression of the working class. Here is a process which is the exact opposite of what occurs under Bonapartism. End quote. Joseph Carter. Third, the role of deliberative self-controlling political action is profoundly different in the proletarian revolution as compared to the bourgeois revolution. Max Shachtman pointed out that, quote, the bourgeois revolution need not necessarily be carried out by the bourgeoisie itself. That is, by the bourgeoisie as a class. The bourgeois revolution need not necessarily bring the bourgeoisie to political power. For the bourgeoisie, it suffices that its economic system predominates. Shachtman. In sharp contrast, the proletarian revolution must begin with the proletariat raising itself to the position of ruling class. The first step, said Marx, is to, quote, win the battle of democracy, end quote. This is so, Shachtman pointed out, because, quote, consciousness and plan imply a self-active, aware, participating, deciding proletariat, which implies in turn a dying out of coercion and bureaucratism, end quote. Shachtman. The encroachment of a new social logic is impossible without untrammeled democracy, civil liberties, a culture of pluralism, with maximum space for initiative from below, and for enforcing the accountability of the government representatives. New section. Democratic Marxism and the Autonomized State. In his last writings, such as Letter to the Workers of the USSR and The Comintern and the GPU, and in his unfinished book on Stalin, where Trotsky explicitly acknowledged that the bureaucracy was struggling independently for the, quote, surplus product and the power, end quote, Trotsky stood on the very edge of declaring the bureaucracy a new exploitative class. This is something that people would debate. But he never revised his theory, to the extent that Trotsky's tragic hesitation was due to a suspicion that to cast a bureaucracy as a ruling class was not compatible with Marxism. Then we have identified another important contribution of Draper to democratic Marxism. For in the first volume of the book, Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, Draper excavated in the writings of Marx and Engels the concept of the, quote, autonomized state. In short, argues Draper, quote, Marx's theory of the state includes provision for historical conjunctures in which a state, completely independent in the fullest sense, cuts loose from its foundations in civil society and turns on them, end quote. Draper. In this framework, Stalinist Russia involved, quote, the complete freeing of the state power, its autonomization from all control by any previous existent social class, and the transformation of the state bureaucracy into a new ruling class exploiting the mass of the people, end quote. Draper. The concept of the, quote, autonomized state was no Weberian sociology, but was present in Marx. In Marx. Draper's claim is not that Marx thought the, quote, state could grow independent of, quote, society, but that, In particular periods of the life course of modes of production, the state could grow independent of any of the classes of society. State autonomization develops to the greatest extent at times of the dissolution of society caused by an equilibrium between the classes. The ruling class on the wane, the up-and-coming class not able to rule. At this moment, a moment that can last for centuries, the state can develop autonomously from all classes, even as it remains dependent on society and social development as such. The state is rather like a kind of historical backstop, which, when the progressive class swings and misses, or does not, for conjunctural reasons, swing at all, develops as a, quote, residual legatee of society. Marx and Engels, Draper insists, discuss the autonomized state in A, the period of the dissolution of the Roman Empire, leading to the, quote, rule of the Praetorians, unquote. B, the period of the dissolution of feudalism producing the absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th centuries, and C, the various Bonapartisms of Europe in the 19th century in the context of equilibrium between bourgeoisie and proletariat. Perhaps Draper could see this more clearly because for 40 years he had argued that D, in the 20th century, the decay and dissolution of capitalism, combined with the failure of the working class to take power and reorganize society, had led to full-blown bureaucratic collectivism in the East and the bureaucratic collectivization of capitalism in the West. For Draper, these were all examples of the autonomized state, quote, a special type of state arising out of, quote, the common ruin of the contending classes, unquote. For when a whole society disintegrates, the only institution remaining to keep society together is the state, not to keep the old society together anymore, but to keep a society, some kind of organized society, together on any terms. The autonomized state becomes the residual legatee of society for a historical period. The political institutionalization of force, the state, infuses all the processes of society and subordinates everything to itself. The political and economic institutions fuse. The state is no longer simply a superstructure. It has swallowed up all of society, unquote. Draper. Draper argued that what is usually taken as the Marxist theory of the state, the managing committee of the ruling class, is only a, quote, special theory of the state which applies to normal times and conditions in roughly the same way as Euclidean geometry applies to normal space, end quote. Draper. The general theory of the state in Marx and Engels views the state as, quote, the necessary and logical product of the given social conditions, end quote. End quote, the executor of the economic necessities of the national situation, end quote. The relationship between this general theory and the, quote, special theory of the managing committee is determined by the stage of becoming of the mode of production as it shifts from birth to normality to crisis and supersession through social struggles. Draper characterizes the state in, quote, normal times as a Caliban to capitalism's Prospero. A servant, yes, but one with, quote, independent aspirations, end quote. In, quote, abnormal times, the state can project a course to autonomization. Quote, the more rapid the change, the more revolutionary the times, the more history is caught in the flux of becoming, the more does the special theory, bracket, the management committee, Alan Johnson, and bracket, begin to warp away from reality, and the more does the general theory of the state become applicable in order to explain the pattern of political power in the process of social transformation, end quote. Draper. The importance of all this for a democratic Marxism is touched on by Hodges and Gandhi's comment that, quote, the merit of Draper's study is to call attention to Marx's groupings toward a sociology of the bureaucracy and to alert contemporary Marxists to the need for a completed social theory, end quote. Gandhi claims that, quote, Draper's thesis that for Marx, the bureaucracy as a class has not received the attention it deserves. If a consensus should emerge that Draper is right, Marx would appear more sophisticated than he does to many on the New Left. He would seem a thinker capable of imagining the dangers of bureaucratization in the future, end quote. Indeed, the conclusion Draper himself drew from this understanding of state and bureaucracy was uncompromising. Quote, in no other era than this does the fight for democracy rise to such a pinnacle of importance for the forces of progress. No other movement in the history of the world, bracket, than Marxism, end bracket, is so driven to place the democratic goal so close to everything it strives for, end quote. Draper. Conclusion, a quote, revolutionary socialism for our day, end quote. Quote, the political character of the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League after 1940 quickly broadened to a wide reinterpretation of the meaning of revolutionary socialism for our day, reacting sharply against the bureaucratic concepts of both official Stalinism and official Trotskyism. It swung to a deep-going emphasis on the integration of socialism and democracy in all aspects of politics. What was distinctive, however, was that this was accompanied by equally sharp opposition to the American establishment, to American imperialism, to capitalism and its political representatives here. What resulted was a unique combination of revolutionary opposition to both capitalism and capital C, communism. End quote. Not sure who that quote's from. Draper? I don't know. Democracy and liberty were the warp and weft of the socialism of the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League, moral value and eudaimonia, economic and political necessity for socialism, sine qua non of self-emancipation. When Draper said democracy should be, quote, desired and defended because it is a vital moral value for humanity, end quote, I think he recast democracy, or more precisely the political participation it enables, as something akin to Hannah Arendt's notion of virtuosity, that playful artistic life-affirming activity by which we know not only political freedom, but know and enjoy our/selves. But if Arendt knew virtuosity required liberty and a democratic and plural polity, a, quote, space of appearances, end quote, as Arendt put it, Draper and the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League knew that liberty and democracy are crushed and distorted by the imperatives of capital until the, quote, space of appearances, end quote, recedes for all but the few. Democracy and liberty require socialism, the cooperative and positive socialization of the economy. But equally, democracy and liberty are a necessity for socialism, for it is impossible to socialize economic power without democracy. That was the lesson of Stalinism. The specific contradiction of Stalinist society was between the necessity of planning, the only other possible economic regulator, the capitalist market, having been abolished, and the impossibility of planning, the only possible basis for planning, democracy, having also been abolished. Bluntly, democracy is a necessity for socialism because without democracy, statification equals totalitarianism. Moreover, the democratic Marxist understood that the democracy which socialism requires is meaningless without liberty. Quote, one of my central ideas in regard to what democracy is that you cannot have any kind of democracy, none whatsoever of any type or form, without the political freedom of people to enter into opposition, uncontrolled as far as the government is concerned. That would make political democracy not the sole content, but the sine qua non of democracy. One of the essential characteristics of such a political democracy is the right of people to oppose and organize their opposition. Free speech, free assembly, come under that head. Free speech without the right to free organization and opposition mean nothing. It is a fake. It is not even free speech. And economic democracy, racial democracy, sexual democracy, do not exist, are not really any kind of democracy without these political rights, end quote. Draper. An important intellectual influence on the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964, Draper defended freedom of speech in opposition to Marcuse, who was busy miseducating the New Left to disregard democratic liberties. Draper insisted that plurality and participation were both necessary to the kind of democracy which could enable self-emancipation. Draper saw Marcuse as a socialist from above. Quote, these elitist types, including the Marcuse types, who give their reactionary views a radical cast, fear democratic liberties in their very bones. They are in the full tradition of Carlyle and Ruskin and H.G. Wells and similar theoreticians expressing the impotent aspirations of disrooted intellectuals for Platonic kingdoms of the philosopher despot. Revolutionary socialists propose to do the opposite. We want to push the limit to the limit, all the presuppositions and practices of the fullest democratic involvement of the greatest mass of people, to the limit that is all the way. No progressive social transformation is possible except insofar as the largest mass of plain people from way below in society start moving. And this movement both requires and also helps to bring about the fullest opening of society to democratic controls from below, not their further restriction. End quote. Draper. In this critique of Marcuse, we can see how Draper fuses the social question and political democracy on the ground of self-emancipation. And he did so from a position in not, quote, post-Marxist thought. Quote, Marxist socialism, communism, as a political program may be most quickly defined as the complete democratization of society, not just of political forms, end quote. Draper. In 1953, Draper wrote, quote, those who fight to push the frontiers of democratic control further and deeper, not as a rearguard of the past, but as a vanguard of a new world, will find themselves fighting for a socialist society, end quote. Draper. The independent socialist league's fight for civil liberties against McCarthyism showed how that approach was taken into the world, and socialism, democracy and liberty articulated as indivisible. Democratic Marxism's dispute with liberalism, said Julie Jacobson, I have a number of pieces by Julius Jacobson on his channel, did not concern the, quote, assumption of the intelligence and rationality of man and his inalienable right to act according to the dictates of his own conscience, end quote, but revolved around the relationship between liberty and capitalism. Like Marx, Jacobson refused to treat freedom in the abstract, but only in its external relations. From this vantage point, he was able to grasp that democratic and individual rights were, quote, never broadly applied voluntarily by the bourgeoisie, end quote, but were always won by popular struggle from below, and that capitalist society eroded individual rights. The authoritarian drift of U.S. society after the war demonstrated that, quote, the inability of a society based on increasing economic inequality to preserve, let alone extend individual liberties, has proved to be, quote, Marxist cant, end quote, but the ugly reality of the bourgeois world, end quote. Draper. So, no, it's Jacobson, I think. Moreover, the failure of U.S. liberals to defend liberal values in the face of the, quote, ugly reality of the permanent war economy and its political reflex, the militarization of U.S. society, was due to more than a collapse of nerve before the senator from Wisconsin. Their ambivalence, argued Jacobson, was rooted in the, quote, inherent contradiction in the philosophy, end quote, of liberalism. The defense of economic liberty was corroding the defense of political liberty. Jacobson concluded that, quote, socialists must take up the defense of liberal values, end quote, abandoned by their, quote, one-time exponents, demonstrating how the fight for truly liberal values is inseparable from the fight against capitalism for socialism. Demonstrating how the fight for truly liberal values is inseparable from the fight against capitalism for socialism, end quote. Jacobson. Albert Camus once remarked that, quote, the great event of the 20th century was the forsaking of the values of freedom by the revolutionary movements, end quote, adding mournfully, quote, since that moment a certain hope has disappeared from the world and a solitude has begun for each and every man, end quote. Camus. Perhaps the historic importance of the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League is that it was a revolutionary movement which did not forsake the values of freedom, but rooted its Marxism in them. The organization was founded on the question McLennan treats as beyond Marxism. Quote, the theoretical role of democracy in the class analysis of politics, end quote. Marginalized in the 20th century, this democratic Marxism might attract a new generation of rebels in the 21st century. It has a rich legacy to offer all those who seek an escape from the cul-de-sac of, quote, proletarian economy, which failed to link socialism to democracy or liberty, but are reluctant to travel in the direction of post-Marxism, which has shown little interest in linking democracy and liberty to socialism. A 20th century socialism from below must articulate socialism, democracy, and liberty in a political project on the social ground of the, quote, real fighting movements, end quote, of its own time. That ongoing project of self-emancipation will find a mighty resource in Hal Draper's writings, which are, quote, as sustained an articulation of socialism from below as exists in English, end quote. And that quote's from Justin Schwartz. And that's the end of the piece itself. Democratic Marxism, the Legacy of Hal Draper. I'm going to read some of the endnotes here. There's some articles and books. George McLennan, Marxism, Pluralism, and Beyond, Classic Debates and New Departures, 1989. Perry Anderson, Trotsky's Interpretation of Stalinism, which is on this channel. Oliver MacDonald, Eastern Bloc Symposium, Workers' Liberty. Hal Draper, Pro-Titoism and Democracy, which I think might be on this channel. I would like to thank the participants of the 1998 Political Studies Association Marxism Specialist Group Conference held at Edge Hill University College, as well as Sean McGomna, Ernest Haberkern, and Debbie Williams for discussions about these ideas, though only the last would share all of them. Vasily Grossman, Forever Flowing. The book, the Stanley Aronowitz book, is The Death and Rebirth of American Radicalism. And it says, the group was called the Workers' Party from 1940 until 1949, when it changed its name to Independent Socialist League in recognition of the reality that it was a fighting propaganda group and not a political party. Useful introductions are the book, The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, Volume 1, edited by Sean McGomna, which is on this channel. Hal Draper, Socialism from Below, which is on this channel. Drucker's book, Max Shachtman is Left, A Socialist Odyssey Through the, quote, American Century, which is on this channel. Alan Johnson's article, Neither Washington Nor Moscow, The Third Campus History and Living Legacy, on this channel. Alan Johnson, The Fate of the Russian Revolution, which is a review of a couple books on this tradition, which is on this channel. See also the book Introduction to Independent Socialism, edited by Hal Draper in 1963, a collection of articles from Labor Action, its weekly newspaper. This can be obtained from the Center for Socialist History, 1250 Addison Street, Berkeley, California. The author is preparing an intellectual biography of Hal Draper, which again didn't come to fruition. The Two Souls of Socialism first appeared in Anvil, the magazine of the Young People's Socialist League of the American Socialist Party, winter 1960. Which is very interesting because I think one of the things that they, the Workers' Party, the Independent Socialist League, under the leadership of Max Shachtman, dissolved in the late 1950s, and they went into the American Socialist Party. That's my understanding. So I don't think Draper followed him. So maybe, so I don't know what the relationship between that and this is, but I think that's interesting. The Draper Archive in Berkeley is being organized under the leadership of Ernest Haberkern and Marty Lippau. See the article by Hal Draper, Myth of Lenin's, quote, Concept of the Party, and, quote, or What They Did to What Is to Be Done, published in Historical Materialism, 1999. See also Hal Draper, Marx, quote, Marxism and Trade Unions, in the book Socialism from Below. See Hal Draper, Independent Socialism and War. Hal Draper, America as Overlord from Yalta to Vietnam. And Johnson's Neither Washington Nor Moscow. Draper wrote extensively on the new movements of the 1960s. See Berkeley, The New Student Revolt, published with Grove Press. Grove Press, I'm not particularly sure. But Grove Press, it's actually interesting that they published with Grove Press, because I feel like Grove Press, that's kind of one of their things, was like being in the vanguard of pushing back against censorship in literature and books. So it would make sense that a book about the free speech movement would be published by Grove Press. Like, for instance, I think they publish like a lot of like subvert books that would be probably by a lot of socialist standards would be considered in bad taste. So, for instance, ooh, one second. I want to see if I'm right here. Yeah, like Grove Press, like I have a book here that let you know what kind of psycho I am, but I have a book by Marquis de Sade here called Juliet, and if you know anything about Marquis de Sade, his books are just kind of like a litany of sexual atrocity, right? That's kind of like what his book is the basis for the basis for the film, for instance, 120 Days of Sodom, the Piero Paolo Pasolini film, famous communist filmmaker in Italy. So Grove Press was published that book. I think they were also Grove Press, and this is another thing that socialists probably would not like as well. I think Grove Press also dabbled in films, or at least like film distribution. I'm not sure. But I think they were kind of instrumental in liberalizing sex and sexuality and nudity in film, which kind of gave way to like the big like pornography boom or whatever in the 1970s. I forget what's one of the Swedish films. It's kind of just a boring, lame film, artsy film, but it had a lot of boobs in it, and they released that and they took it to court and all these kinds of things. So in the defense of free expression, so it's interesting that Draper would have a book with Grove Press, and also what left-wing press would have published them at this point. I mean, I know his books were eventually published with Monthly Review, even though Monthly Review, I would argue, is very much hostile to Draper's politics. So it's nice that they published this thing, but this was later. I don't know if they would do now, but like I would think it's pretty obvious that Monthly Review is kind of like I've heard it referred to as soft Stalinist, which I think is very apt. A lot of like third worldist, Maoist-y kind of stuff published with it, right? So I don't know if he has been able to even get into Monthly Review in this point in the early 1960s, but who knows? But sorry for that little detour. But I just thought that was interesting. See Draper's piece, Free Speech Movement, Freedom Fighters and Misguided Rebels, published in New Politics, 1965. The article In Defense of the, quote, New Radicals, 1965. And the article Marxist Women versus Bourgeois Feminism, published in Socialist Register, 1976. See Norberto Bobbio's book Liberalism and Democracy, published with Verso in 1990. It says, Ernest Haberkorn is currently preparing the 5th and 6th volumes of Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution. From Draper's notes, they will examine Marx's political theory of war and revolution, the road to socialism, party organization, and the socialist society. Okay, so I know what I'm talking about. I knew there was more volumes than what was being said here. Ernest Haberkorn's a kind of an interesting character. I find him he's very, what's the word? His writing style is very, like, grumpy old man and cantankerous and very, like, undiplomatic, even towards people that he very much should be diplomatic to, such as various types of libertarian socialists, but also just, like, he has this whole thing that a book about how Victor Serge is, like, a totalitarian or something like that, which, not that there's no problematic politics or whatever for Serge at all in different points of his life, for sure, but I don't know precisely what the content of that essay is, but it's very, I find it quite I find just like the whole title like excessively provocative. It makes me want to read it, but I'm like, that's ridiculous. Also, I think he called the fucking like CNTFAI totalitarian in the context of the Spanish Civil War. It's like, what are you fucking talking about? But again, I haven't read the piece, so maybe he has got something there. C. Draper's Charity Welfare State in the Walls of Jericho, Labor Action, 1952. Draper's article, The Independent Socialist Outlook, Theses on the Struggle for the World in the Present Epoch of Capitalism and Stalinism. I think that might be on this channel. See Norman Garris's article, Democracy and the Ends of Marxism, published in 1994 with New Left Review. Let's see. It says, the idea that Marx's concept of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, was systematically misunderstood can also be found in Sidney Hook's 1934 article, Workers' Democracy, in the Modern Monthly, and in Lucien Leroux's book, Marxism and Democracy. Lucien Leroux, I think, it's not said here, but Lucien Leroux was kind of people, just a side note, this is just a thing that kind of gets on my nerves, is like people are trying to find like the authentic originator of like bureaucratic collectivism theory. For one, the mere possibility of bureaucratic collectivism was something that was already talked about by people like Bakunin, but also by what the hell is his name? Majewski or whatever the hell, the guy who's like kind of like sort of like kind of like Robert Michel's or whatever, like criticizing bureaucratism of the socialist movement from like a socialist perspective or like an anarchist perspective. I mean, both those people were already saying these things rather early on, so that possibility is there. But Lucien Leroux, the reason I'm saying this is that Lucien Leroux, for instance, was already calling the USSR a non-capitalist, non-socialist class society that was exploitative and totalitarian in this book, Marxism and Democracy. I haven't read all of Lucien Leroux's Marxism and Democracy, but I did read the piece, the part of the book that are directly pertain to the Soviet Union. See Draper's article, Joseph Weidemeyer's Dictatorship of the Proletariat, published in the Labor History, 1962. See also Hal Draper's article, Marx and the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, published in New Politics, summer 1962. See Sam Farber's Before Stalinism, The Rise and Fall of Soviet Democracy. I'd like to read that book because I know Sam Farber comes from like the third campus tradition, but I think he pushes the decline of the counter-revolution that the bureaucratic collectivist thinks happens much earlier than what most anti-Stalinists as opposed to anti-Leninists would say, right? So that's like a thing, like the Council Communists, for instance, were already saying that there was a counter-revolution like in the early 1920s, for instance, like Pannekoek, right? And at the time, by the way, whereas the people who come out of Trotskyism always kind of mark the counter-revolution, which they do say happened. If they have a state capitalist or a bureaucratic collectivist conception, they do say that a counter-revolution did in fact occur, but they say it was like, the late 1920s with the final exclusion of like the left opposition or the introduction of the first 5-year plan, which I believe started in 1927. Actually, it might start in 1928. I think 1928 is actually the year it started. Yeah, so I'd like to read that book by Sam Farber. See Herman Benson's book, The Communist Party at the Crossroads, Toward Democratic Socialism or Back to Stalinism. That's from 1957, and it was published with the Independent Socialist League. See Shachtman's article, The Party That Won Victory, Lenin's Contribution to the Revolution, from New International, 1944. See Ross Gandy's review, blah, blah, blah. See Hannah Arendt's article, Freedom and Politics, in D. Miller's edited volume, Liberty. See Julius Falk, which is the nom de plume or nom de guerre of Julius Jacobson's article, Capitalism's Threat to Democracy, published with Labor Action 1953. That quote from Albert Camus is published in Irving Howe's edited volume, A Margin of Hope, an Intellectual Autobiography. Irving Howe was who's very fundamental in like the democratic socialist tradition in the United States. For instance, he initiated the Democratic Socialist journal, Dissent. I'm pretty sure. I think that was his doing. But he comes out of also like originally out of Third Campism. I mean, he drops out by the early 1950s for this more democratic socialist position. But he comes from that. So and so does for that matter, so does the initiator of the DSA, Michael Harrington. So all these tankies and Stalinists that the DSA has allowed into their ranks with their really shitty anti-imperialism and their really, let's be real, some of their very anti-Semitic positions on Israel-Palestine are a stab in the back to the anti-totalitarianism that the Democratic Socialist, the DSA, was supposed to represent. Yeah, so that's the end of the footnotes. Thank you endnotes. Thank you so much for listening. This piece is by again. This piece was titled "Democratic Marxism: The Legacy of Hal Draper" by Alan Johnson. Thank you so much for listening.